Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. This is Knoxville's torture slayings, the savage murders of Christopher Newsom and Channon Christian. Brilliant. It's going to be a joyful episode, isn't it? Thanks, Matt Markham, who wrote this. Nice to have you back. It's been a minute. Looking forward to it. The format of the show, if you're new here, I've never read this before. We're going to read it together and explore it together, dear audience. And it's probably going to be unpleasant. I mean, you tuned into a true crime show. What did you expect? The intro to today's script serves as a content warning. The episode revolves around the horrific murders of two people, Christopher Newsom and Channon Christian, a young Knoxville couple that died horrifically violent deaths in what has been called the most gruesome double homicide in the city's history. However, even that doesn't quite do it justice. Known today as Knoxville's torture slayings, this singular event was so barbaric and involved so many people that it resulted in 5 separate criminal trials, sparked a national discussion about what constitutes a hate crime against white people, and inspired the city's first Ku Klux Klan rally in the better part of a century. Oh, good Lord, what has happened? Furthermore, as if that wasn't somehow enough, controversy over how 4 of those 5 trials were conducted would see Knoxville's long-serving criminal court judge disbarred and jailed, while hundreds of his rulings were called into question, opening the door to years upon years of re-examining and re-litigating old cases to ensure fair trials were held. What is happening? This case is also the reason that I personally support the death penalty. Wow, holy... Okay. The couple. Chris Newsom, whose full name was Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., was a 23-year-old native Knoxvillian and Halls High School graduate and enjoyed sports of all kinds from a young age. He was particularly talented at baseball, which he played in high school. However, he also loved golf, which he often played as an adult in between working as a carpenter and attending classes at Pellissippi State Community College. On weekends, he loved to fish, woodwork, play tennis, and do many other physical activities. His parents, Hugh Sr. and Mary, were very present in his life and had high hopes for him. Seems like a good kid. Likewise, Channon Gail Christian was also very active and athletic, but she was not from Knoxville originally. She was born in Texas in 1985 and had spent time in Louisiana in the home of her own loving parents, Gary and Dina. Their family relocated in 1997 when Channon was 12 years old. She attended high school on the other side of the county from Chris at Farragut High. Then, in 2003, she moved to the University of Tennessee, where she was studying to obtain a degree in sociology. At the same time, she worked a part-time job at a local shoe store called Shoe Department inside Westtown Mall. A very creative name. There's a shoe shop here where I live called Office Shoes. And I remember I needed a smart pair of shoes, and I don't have a lot of occasions for smart pairs of shoes. This was a long time ago. And so I was like, okay, I'll just go to this Office Shoes shop. Obviously, being called Office Shoes, they probably sell smart shoes. Nope, entirely sells trainers, sneakers, Americans, tennis shoes, rest of the world. I was like, what, why is this called Office Shoes? Do you have any smart shoes? And they're like, no, we sell trainers. And they didn't find this odd. I'm like, all right, I guess I'll go somewhere else, thanks. Upon meeting one another by chance in 2006, when Channon was 21 and Chris was 23, they fell in love immediately. Channon thought Chris was handsome and kind, and Chris was equally infatuated with her. They got to know one another while playing golf because, like Chris, Channon has spent a large amount of time on golf courses with her fathers and brothers as a child. She and Chris would reportedly talk to one another for hours as they slowly walked between holes. This sounds nice. Sounds very nice. Though I don't like it, because this episode is called The Torture Slayings. Of their relationship, Channon's mother would say, I know Chris had fallen pretty hard, and I know Channon was very happy. Things were going so well, in fact, that there were rumors among their friends and family that a quick marriage proposal was on the horizon, but as Simon likes to point out, this is not the Happy Fun Times channel, so the possibility of that proposal, marriage, and long life together would soon be snuffed out. The party. It was the late evening of January 6th, 2007, when everything would change for the Newsom and Christian families, though not one person in their lives could have realistically predicted it, especially considering the day had started as one of celebration. That evening at around 7:30 p.m., Channon was sitting inside the living room of one of her best friends, Cara Soward, at the Washington Ridge Apartments in East Knoxville. She had just finished working a short shift at Shoe Department and had stopped by to clean herself up and change clothes while she waited for Chris to meet her there. She was getting cleaned up because they had big plans. All three of them intended to attend a birthday party at the home of a mutual friend in Halls. This was something they'd been looking forward to. However, by this point in the evening, Channon was slightly aggravated with Chris because things were not going according to plan. He was late on account of good weather. He's like, no, I wanted to do a bit more golfing. You see, the plan had been for Chris to meet Channon at Cara's apartment, where he would leave his truck parked so they could all ride to the party together in Channon's 2005 Toyota 4Runner. However, because my hometown of Knoxville is situated in an area... Oh, Matt's from Knoxville. Oh no, this happened in Matt's town. In an area where seasonal temperature averages are a little more than a suggestion, it had been above 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius all that January afternoon. Holy 15 degrees in January? It's very nice. As such, Chris and his best friend, Josh Anderson, who was also planning to attend the party with them, had spent the slightly chilly afternoon on the golf course, and time had completely gotten away from them. Oh, I knew it. He's just got lost playing golf. Now they were both very, very late, hence Channon's aggravation. At around 8 p.m, with Chris still not having shown up, Channon phoned him to air her frustrations and come up with a new plan because Cara didn't want to be late herself, and since Channon still wanted to wait for Chris, Cara was going to head to the party on her own and leave Channon with a key to her apartment to lock up. At the same time, Chris was going to drop Josh off at the house party because it was on the way to Cara's apartment. Then he was going to meet up with Channon. He would leave his truck parked in the parking lot, and he and Channon would leave in a 4Runner. They would stop for food on the way to the party because both of them were very hungry by this point. This way, they'd be late to the party, but at least they'd still be going. Yeah, it seems to be like a house party or something. It's okay if you arrive a little bit late. Although, if you've made plans to meet up with someone, and you just why are you late? I forgot about the time I was playing golf. I'll be pissed. I'm very punctual, and I don't like it when people are not punctual, and I don't have enough social reservations to not tell people. I'll be like, please don't be late again. I can be a real dick about it, because I'm like, if someone's like, if I meet someone for dinner and they're 50 minutes late, I'll just leave. And they'll be like, what happened? I'll be like, well, you're 50 minutes late, I left. I wasn't going to just sit here by myself for like another 10 minutes. With this new plan in place, Cara grabbed her purse and headed for the door. She left Channon sitting in her living room on her computer. She noted that she was dressed in a pair of jeans, a multicolored striped sweater, and a pair of hot pink heels. Beside her sat the grey purse she planned to carry that night. Unbeknownst to Cara, this would be the last time she would see her friend alive. A little after 8 p.m, Cara arrived at the party. Then a short time later, Chris dropped Josh off and left to go get Channon. At this point, both Cara and Josh began enjoying the party without any concerns, but at around 10 p.m, it became hard to ignore the fact that neither Chris nor Channon had shown up. This was notable to everyone because neither was known to be the type to blow off a social gathering without at least calling or texting. Soon, anxiety started to creep in as Cara, Josh, and multiple other people attempted to make contact via phone calls and texts without luck. Because Cara's apartment was only about a 10-minute drive from the Hall's house party, Josh and another of Chris's friends ventured out to investigate at around 11 p.m. There they found that Chris's truck was sitting in the parking lot and noted that Channon's 4Runner was absent. This, they assumed, meant that both had left together as planned. However, they couldn't be sure. To be confident that no one was still inside Cara's apartment, Josh knocked on Cara's door multiple times, but he got no answer. He could not check inside because he did not have a key. He also called Chris's phone again while in the parking lot, but got the same result. No answer. Since it was beginning to rain, Josh grabbed Chris's golf clubs out of the bed of his truck to prevent them from getting wet and then peered into the cab to see if Chris had accidentally left his cell phone behind. Okay, at this point, I'd assume that they went for dinner, and then they decided that they didn't want to go to the house party. And I'd be like, okay, it's out of character, but it's not the craziest thing to do. I wouldn't be super worried yet. I mean, I don't know these people, so maybe it is extremely out of character. I would say it would be out of character for me, but I don't think people would find it so odd. He saw no sign of the phone. The friend group then traced the route Chris and Channon could have taken to the party to make sure they had not broken down, but they could not locate the 4Runner. It's a Toyota 4Runner. Wasn't this happening? Wasn't it new? Yeah, it was a year old. It's a Toyota 4Runner, a year old. Actually, it's not breaking down. My first car was a Toyota. That was indestructible. They couldn't locate the 4Runner along the main road. Somehow the couple had completely disappeared, and no one else at the party heard anything from them for the rest of the night. One person who did hear from Channon, however, was Channon's father. Channon called him at exactly 12:33 a.m. to report that she'd changed her mind about attending the party and would be arriving home sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. She didn't elaborate further about why she'd changed her mind, nor did she tell him where she currently was. He would later recount that she sounded completely normal on the call. Of course, their friends at the party still had no way of knowing this, so they all continued to worry. When Cara returned to her apartment at around 3 a.m., she found that Chris's truck was still in the parking lot. Her front door was still locked, and everything inside was in order. Channon's overnight bag was missing, indicating that she did not intend to return. Cara then went to bed, hoping that her friend would turn up the following morning and explain what had happened. Yeah, I don't think this is like, it'd be like, oh, this is weird, but I wouldn't be, I wouldn't lose sleep. I'd just be like, oh, she's with Chris, I'm sure it's fine. Unhelpful phone calls. When Dina Christian awoke for work at around 6 a.m. on January the 7th, she discovered that Gary Christian had fallen asleep in the living room while waiting up for their daughter. She jostled him awake, and after being told about the unexpected call from the prior night, immediately began to worry, especially after trying to call Channon back and discovering that her cell phone was switched off. Yeah, now I would be more worried. But it wasn't until Shannon's boss at shoe department called to ask why she'd not shown up for work that the panic truly began to set in. Channon had never missed a day of work without calling in. At this point, Channon's mother had then placed a call to Chris's parents to inform them of the situation. This is when she was told that Chris was also missing, and his phone had also been switched off. After contacting Channon's friends and all the local hospitals in the area to confirm that neither had been admitted as patients, Gary and Dina decided it was time to file a missing persons report with the Knox County Sheriff's Department. Thanks to the information provided by Cara, they were able to give an accurate description of what Channon had been wearing and what her and Chris's new plans had been before their disappearance. Based on the information from Chris's family, they were also able to relay that he had last been seen wearing jeans, a blue set of sweater with white collar, and a pair of black and white trainers, and a University of Tennessee baseball cap. Legally speaking, the information Gary and Dina brought to the police should have been more than enough to start an investigation. However, the Knoxville Police Department told the families the age-old myth that they needed to wait at least 24 hours before reporting someone missing. Until that time, they said they could not help them and advised that they continue trying to make contact and double-check any local spots that the couple were known to frequent. If they didn't turn up by the following morning, the KPD would launch a full investigation. Unable to sit idly by, this is exactly what Gary and Dina then did. They organized a search party to go out and begin combing the streets. This party included Cara Soward and Josh Anderson, both of whom were still very worried about their friends. Unfortunately, what no one yet realized was that it was entirely too late. Chris's body had already been discovered, and the only reason the police hadn't made the connection was because he was unrecognizable. Wait, so the police find a body? And I mean, they must be able to guess a rough age. You'd be like, okay, 20s. And then someone reports a 20-year-old man missing, and they don't even think about it. I mean, Jesus Christ, how big is Knoxville? I mean, maybe it is quite big. I have heard of it. Beside the train tracks. At around 12:20 p.m. on January the 7th, a Norfolk Southern Railroad employee named J.D. Ford had been doing his regular run from Knoxville to Chattanooga when shortly after setting out from the station, a small fire beside the tracks had caught his eye. As the train had drawn closer, he'd watched the fire closely because he thought he could see a log or something similar at its center. Once he'd gotten alongside it, he had realized it was a body. Quickly, Ford had halted the train, disembarked, and approached, just close enough to confirm that his eyes were not playing tricks on him. He then backed away and phoned his supervisor. All right, I'd phone the police first, and then I'd call my supervisor, but that's just me. It's a burning body. In that situation, do you attempt to put out the fire? Because you don't want to, touch a crime scene, right? But also you're like, well, that body is burning. The evidence is literally burning. Yeah, I guess I would attempt. You're on a train, right? You got a fire extinguisher. I'd put the fire out. I don't think you'd get in trouble for, tampering with a crime scene, right? That's the right call. Put the fire out, right? And the police are like, why'd you tamper with the crime scene? 5 years in prison. It's like, what the f-? Now, I've been writing for this channel long enough that I hope you all know I'm naturally inclined to leave out the goriest details of most crimes. Yes, please. But to truly understand the barbarity of Chris's final hours, you must know the brutal condition his body was discovered in. While his official cause of death was determined to be 3 gunshot wounds, one in the lower body, another in the spine, a third in the head, those were only the beginning of his injuries. Despite the fire damage, it was obvious that Chris had been tortured. His wrists and ankles were bound with shredded fabric. There was a sweatshirt wrapped around his head and shoestrings tied tightly around his neck. He had numerous contusions on his body, severe damage to his genitals, and he had been repeatedly, violently, anally sodomized both by a person and with an object. In his final moments, Chris had been shot while on his knees with a bandana covering his eyes, a sock stuffed inside his mouth, and a leather belt fastened around his ankles. It was a brutal sight that made several officers have to walk away from sheer disgust. Because of the levels of burns on Chris's body, it was clear an accelerant had been used. That would make it impossible for police to recover any usable DNA evidence, though the coroner would later report that semen was present inside his anus. Another notable thing was Chris's feet were bare and covered in mud, indicating that he had been marched to the site of his execution, likely from somewhere nearby. As the police expanded their search, they discovered a broken dog leash lying beside several pieces of multicolored fabric, the same type used to secure Chris's wrists. They believed Chris had been forced to wear the collar at one point, but it had been discarded about 50 yards away from the fire. Chipman Street. As authorities were loading Chris's remains into a coroner's van, the Newsom and Christian families were still organizing search parties and working to track the couple down. Among them was Josh and Kara, who had both spent the day driving up and down the county's side roads looking for any signs of the pair. They had come up empty-handed. However, a crucial clue uncovered by Gary Christian was about to give them all a new direction. Their cell phone provider revealed that Channon's cell phone had last pinged off a tower near the intersection of Cherry Street and East Magnolia Avenue in East Knoxville. Wow, how did they get that information so quickly? The cell phone provider just reveals that information. You'd be like, hey, I'm trying to track this person down. They'll be like, oh, yeah, no, I'll be pretty... Like, that feels like obviously useful in this case. Obviously. But that does feel like something you should need a subpoena to get. Like, that feels like a pretty big invasion of privacy. For those of you not from Knoxville, which I imagine is a decent majority of you, East Knoxville is known as the rough part of town, and the intersection of Cherry Street and Magnolia is about as bad as it gets. This is a long-standing reputation that predated this incident, as its crime rate is exceptionally high. Yet the search party was undeterred as they ventured out to Cherry Street late in the night, combing the area. And at about 1:30 a.m., they unexpectedly struck gold when they stumbled upon a 4Runner parked at the corner of Chipman and Glider. Chipman is a smaller side street that is classified as a mixed-use industrial residential neighborhood. They're a mixed-use industrial residential? That sounds unpleasant. It's only about a quarter of a mile and runs parallel between a set of train tracks on I-40. On the other, the location for Waste Connection, the city's trash service. Unbeknownst to the search party, this was not far from where Chris's body had been discovered earlier that day. Seeing the vehicle's condition, everyone at the scene knew that the discovery was not a hopeful sign. It appeared abandoned, and all of its identifying decals had recently been scraped away. Inside, the front seats were pushed all the way back, too far for Channon to reach the pedals. The back floorboard was caked with mud, and most of Channon's personal belongings, including her overnight bag and a bag of clothes she planned to donate to charity, were missing. There were also some items inside the car that did not belong to either Chris or Channon, such as an empty pack of Newport cigarettes. The family then backed away and phoned the police. Good shout. Later that night, the authorities were sorting through the vehicle themselves. A team of officers branched out and began interviewing residents of the surrounding houses, trying to determine if anyone knew anything about the vehicle, and this is when they stumbled upon a resident named Sandra Colleen Bible, who said the 4Runner... Her surname's actually Bible. I've never heard that before. Who said the 4Runner had not been parked there at midnight when she last walked out to her porch to smoke a cigarette before bed. She also said she'd never seen the vehicle on their street before that night. This meant that the search party had missed whoever parked the car there by no more than an hour. Once photos were taken, the 4Runner was then inventoried and towed to the police impound lot, where a senior evidence technician named Dan Crenshaw, not the Texas congressman, okay, glad, no idea who Dan Crenshaw is, began checking for prints. To his surprise, the exterior of the car was wiped clean and no fingerprints could be obtained. Inside the car, however, he found a bank envelope sitting on the back seat that contained a very usable print. When checking it against their database, he found that it belonged to a man named Lamarcus Duval Davidson, who just happened to live on Chipman Street. Uh-oh, you've done a sloppy-ass crime, Lamarcus. At around 7 a.m., another technician confirmed Crenshaw's work, and KPD investigator Todd Childress was informed of the match. Childress then began looking into Davidson, and he didn't like what he saw. Davidson was, among many other things, a known carjacker from Memphis, Tennessee, who had recently been released from prison for aggravated robbery. He was renting the home on Chipman Street and had an outstanding warrant for his arrest for failing to appear in court for a different set of unrelated charges. The Raid. At exactly 1:39 p.m. that afternoon, the Knoxville Police Department's Special Operations Squad arrived outside of 2316 Street to execute the search warrant they had obtained for Davidson's home. They were led by Lieutenant Keith DeBow, who knew the time was not on their side. If Channon was still alive, she was likely inside and in need of immediate assistance. They knocked briefly and then entered forcefully. While clearing the small structure, two things became immediately obvious. Nobody was home, and something sinister had taken place within the dilapidated, roach-infested walls around them. In the living room, several chairs sat upright with rope beside them. In the bedroom, multiple items related to firearms lay scattered about: a carbine rifle, a gun case, several cartridges for various caliber weapons, and multiple cleaning kits. Am I right in thinking that if you're a convicted criminal, you can't purchase a gun? Isn't that what Joe Biden's son got in trouble for? He was like a drug offender, had a criminal record, and then he bought a gun somehow or something. And they were like, you shouldn't have done that. So this is bad for them already. Alongside these was ample evidence that suggested Channon had been inside the home at some point, including a grey purse, the clothing she planned to donate to charity, and several photographs she kept in her vehicle. Channon's iPod was also found inside Davidson's bedroom, which had the inscription, "Channon Christian, Mum and Dad, we love you." To be clear, much more evidence would be found inside the home in the coming hours, but before anyone could sift through it all, something else caught Lieutenant DeBow's eye. In the kitchen, a large trash can bulging at the sides appeared out of place. DeBow pointed it out to another officer, and both men then drew their weapons, believing Davidson could be hiding inside. As they approached, DeBow threw open the lid, and he quickly discovered something far worse. We know what it is. As Channon's mother would later tell the media, they stuffed her in a trash can like a piece of trash. Once again, I apologize for the graphic description, but the details are important. Shannon's body was upside down. She was hogtied using shredded sheets and wrapped up inside 5 trash bags, with a 6th trash bag wrapped loosely around her head. She had died of asphyxiation with her eyes open. But like Chris, her gruesome manner of death was the least horrifying detail of other non-lethal injuries to her body. The medical examiner would later state in court that Channon had endured extreme sexual assault that went beyond the definition of standard sexual assault. She had been R-worded repeatedly, sodomized by a broken table leg, and had extreme hemorrhaging on her head and groin, along with bruises and carpet burns on much of her body. Horrifically, bleach and drain cleaner had been poured down her throat and onto her genitals. Witnesses. Knowing that locating Davidson would prove difficult due to his lack of employment and active criminal lifestyle, an APB was put out, and every officer in the area was asked to memorize his face. Yet even in these early stages of the hunt, there was strong suspicion that Davidson had not acted alone, as it was fairly obvious that other people had been staying inside his home around the time of the murders. His 2 spare bedrooms appeared lived in, and a crude makeshift bed, assembled of old pallets, was set up in the living room. Classy. As police attempted to find out who'd been sleeping in those beds, other investigators set out to interview neighbors and other potential witnesses who may have seen something crucial in the prior days. This yielded some promising information. Jerome Arnold, who lived approximately 1 block down from Davidson, stated he was watching television at around 1:45 a.m. on the night Chris and Channon disappeared when he heard 3 distinct and evenly spaced pops coming from the direction of the railroad tracks behind his home. He did not call them in because gunshots were a common occurrence in that area of town. Another man, Roy Thurman, who worked as a sandblasting company on the other side of Chipman Street, stated he noticed smoke rising from the direction of the tracks as he arrived at work at around 7:45 a.m. the following morning. This helped police establish an early timeline indicating Chris had been killed just a few short hours after his disappearance. However, a third man would provide the most useful information of all. Xavier Jenkins was an employee of Waste Connections, which sat directly adjacent to Davidson's home. At around 12:30 a.m. on the night Chris and Channon went missing, he was sitting in his car outside the building's gated parking lot waiting for his supervisor to arrive so that he could start his shift when he noticed something out of the ordinary at Davidson's house. Not only was the porch light on, but the interior of the home was buzzing with activity. He also noted that Shannon's 4Runner was parked in front of the home. He was able to identify it by the distinct University of Tennessee decals on the rear window, which had not yet been removed. After a few more minutes of waiting for his supervisor, who was about 15 minutes late by this point, Xavier then drove down to a nearby gas station. He bought a pack of peanut M&Ms and a Pepsi before returning. He once again parked in his usual spot and began eating his snack, and this is when Shannon's 4Runner began backing out of the driveway. It turned in his direction and deliberately drove past him very slowly. As it did, Xavier saw 4 black men filling the front and back seats. They were all staring directly at him, and the driver, who was wearing a hoodie, mean-mugged him as he drove past. I don't know what mean-mugged is. Mean-mugged him? This is one of those phrases that you learn in life surprisingly late. I didn't know what being pistol-whipped was. I thought it actually involved a literal whip until way too late in my life. I thought there was some sort of thing called a pistol whip. And it turns out it's just someone beating you in the face with a gun. This encounter was so chilling, it caused Xavier to immediately pull out his cell phone and call his father to report what had happened. Not long after, Xavier's boss arrived, so he pulled himself together and went to work his route. When he returned at around 6:30 a.m., he saw Shannon's 4Runner had also been returned and was then parked in front of Waste Connections. He once again recognized it by the University of Tennessee decals on the windows and noted that there was no one inside. However, it still appeared very out of place, and Xavier suspected it had been stolen by the 4 men. Curious, he approached the vehicle and looked inside, but still could not see anything out of the ordinary. This was the best info police had received so far, as it further confirmed their theory that multiple people were involved, although it still didn't give them much to go on because Xavier was not able to identify any of the 4 men. Fortunately, however, something new had been discovered inside the home that would do just that. DVD copies of The Manchurian Candidate, That's Collateral, and The 40-Year-Old Virgin, each with a label indicating that they'd been checked out of the Marion County Public Library in Lebanon, Kentucky, 180 miles north of Knoxville. When police called to check who'd last reserved these movies, they were given the name of Davidson's half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins. The Girlfriend. As the search for brothers Lamarcus Davidson and Latalvis Cobbins heated up, investigators turned their attention to the only person who they believed might be able to provide insight into what had happened and who else could be involved. A young woman named Daphne Sutton. She was Davidson's girlfriend, and her name was listed on the Chipman lease. That's how police found her, and although she was not involved in the murder and did not know where Davidson was at that moment, by the time authorities caught up with her, she had already learned of Chris and Channon's death and was ready to spill the beans on everything she could, and she had quite a story to tell. According to Daphne, she and Davidson had been dating since his release from prison in the fall of 2006, and they'd been living together for several months. A few weeks earlier, right after Christmas, 3 guests had arrived at Davidson's home from Kentucky. They were Davidson's half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, Cobbins' girlfriend, Vanessa Coleman, and their mutual friend, Jeroj Thomas. They had all 3 hitched a ride south in exchange for drugs and had essentially moved into Davidson and Daphne's home temporarily. The day before the kidnapping, January 5th, 2007, she and Davidson had gotten into a physical altercation. Davidson had put his hands around her neck and pushed her up against a wall. This had caused her to flee the home and walk to a nearby gas station to call her friend Cassie Suttles for help. Cassie then picked Daphne up and took her to her apartment where she slept overnight. She did not see Davidson the rest of the night or the following day. Or I'd kind of hope ever again. However, on January 7th, the day after the kidnapping, while the families were out searching, Daphne received a call from Davidson. He wanted to apologize for attacking her and was asking to see her, but Daphne said she would not forgive him. Good move. He's looking for an alibi, isn't he? She thought he was cheating on her, partly because she believed he could hear a woman in the background during their phone call. To find out if her suspicions were true, she then returned to the home on Chipman Street. She told Davidson she was there to retrieve some makeup, perfume, and other toiletry items that she'd left behind. When she pulled in, she saw Davidson standing on the porch and noted he had hung a curtain to block her view of the living room. She then marched past Davidson into their home and attempted to enter the bathroom, but it was locked. Davidson told her Vanessa Coleman was in the bathroom, but Daphne did not believe him. She then attempted to enter the bathroom using its second entrance, which connected from the home's second bedroom, but before she could, Davidson grabbed her arm and told her not to go back there. She didn't understand why, and neither Cobbins nor Thomas, who were both present inside the home at that time, would explain. Aggravated and still suspicious, Daphne then turned to leave. As she was going, Davidson offered her a small wad of cash and a bag of clothing that he claimed to have purchased for her. This is really weird. I don't even know what's happening. This is like the sloppiest, I just don't really have anything to add other than this is fucking miserable. She refused to take the cash, but accepted the clothing. She and Cassie then returned to Cassie's apartment, where they started looking through the clothing, and this is when they realized something else wasn't right. None of the clothes were Daphne's size, they were all used, and there was a red skirt among the clothing. This last part was significant because Davidson was part of a gang that did not like red. Oh, is this like a Crips and Bloods thing? They have specific colors, right? One is red, one is blue. I don't know which one, but okay, that seems relevant. She then called him and told him to return and take the clothing back because she did not want it. Davidson visited Cassie's apartment 2 separate times that afternoon, and Daphne remembers he was driving a 4Runner that she had never seen before. Bro, you could not look more guilty. He was also wearing shoes that were a size too small. Later that day, she and Davidson picked up drug money for someone out of a trash can at a buddy's barbecue and then purchased cocaine and pills. They then returned to Cassie's apartment at around midnight and were together all night and all day on Monday. During this time, she still was not aware of the kidnappings or murders. But on Tuesday morning, January the 9th, Daphne received a phone call from her mother stating that a dead woman had been found in Davidson's home. She says she didn't have the phone on speaker, but Davidson could hear the conversation because he was lying in bed beside her. When he realized what they were discussing, he sat up, his eyes got very big, and he started praying, "Please, God, please. Jesus Christ." After learning this, Cassie told Davidson that he had to leave her apartment immediately because the police would be looking for him. He refused, stating that he needed to wait until sundown. They all then waited around the apartment until then, at which time Daphne dropped Davidson off at a nearby park. That was the last time Daphne said that she had spoken to Davidson, and she did not know what else had happened since. She assumed he was on the run and may have returned to Memphis. As for the other 3, she speculated that they likely fled back to Kentucky, and she was right. The arrests. When reviewing Davidson's cell phone records, police learned that he had been in near constant contact with a man named Eric Boyd after the murders. Boyd was a man he met in prison, and after being released, they'd become friends and business partners in the drug trade. Police were able to catch up with Boyd at his mother's home, and although he first claimed not to know Davidson, his story quickly changed as they explained why they were looking for him. According to court transcripts, Boyd told investigators he wasn't going down for someone else's murder and then pointed the police toward Davidson's hideout, a vacant home he admitted he and Davidson had burglarized the same day Chris and Channon had been abducted. You snitch. I'm not going down for this crime. You learn nothing from prison, Eric. At this point, a SWAT team was dispatched to locate and arrest Davidson. Awesome. He was found exactly where Boyd had indicated, hiding inside the vacant home, surrounded by what few items he had taken with him or stolen after fleeing Cassie's apartment. He was still wearing the shoes that Daphne had described. They were later determined to belong to Chris Newsom. Bro is really stupid. You've just gone and killed someone, and you're wearing their shoes. Do you not think about things for half a second? Do you have like an IQ of 4? As he was being escorted to the police station, Davidson exclaimed that he ain't done nothing to that girl. What girl? What girl, Davidson? What are you talking about? What are you talking about, Davidson? What girl? Tell me more. He then pointed the finger at his half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, and Cobbins' best friend, George Thomas. Fine. Did you learn nothing in prison, you snitching bitch? Thanks to help from the police in Lebanon, Kentucky, Cobbins and Thomas were both arrested on January 11th. They were booked into the local jail. However, Lebanon police did eventually make a fourth arrest on the day after the raid on Cobbins' home, which revealed that Cobbins' girlfriend, Vanessa Coleman, was in possession of several items belonging to Channon, including her cosmetic bag, change purse, and overnight bag. They also found a diary entry that hinted she was at least somewhat knowledgeable about what had occurred inside Davidson's home. You write down your crimes. You're writing down crimes. Let's see. Last night was one of a kind. We stayed with a crackhead that is cool as hell. It snowed a little bit, but it's already melted. Talk about adventures. I had one hell of an adventure, all caps, since I've been in the Big TN. Tennessee, I assume. It's a crazy world these days, but I love the fun adventures and lessons that I've learned. It's going to be a long, interesting year. Okay, not really admitting to anything, keeping it very vague. And she was certainly right about that last part, if interesting includes waiting for endless court dates and eating prison slop. Back in Knoxville, police then arrested Eric Boyd, the man who had pointed police to Davidson's hideout for being an accessory after the fact. This was done after it was determined he had been hiding with Davidson inside the house and had only ventured out to gather supplies for the pair on the morning the police had found and questioned him. Though, as they were about to learn, he had done much more than that. I get the feeling he's helping to kind of clear up after the crime or whatever. He seems like that kind of piece of shit. Who, what, when, where, and why. For those of you who may have lost count of the number of suspects arrested so far, yes indeed, I don't blame you. There's a lot of moving parts in this story, so I'll remind you that the answer is 5. LaMarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd. And once those 5 were ushered into separate interrogation rooms, each immediately began flipping on one another, attempting to shift blame away from themselves. They each told convoluted stories of how they were not personally responsible for the deaths and had simply been dragged along or forced to participate in some way. This is where gang laws come into play, right? Because you can, at least I believe it works in the UK, it's been a long time, let's see if I remember this, that if you, in a group of people, and you can reasonably foresee that another person in that group is going to cause grievous bodily harm or kill someone, and you're there, you are also guilty of murder. Right? And because of this, because of gangs. I think the US has something similar, but I guess we'll find out. This created a major headache for the police because they suddenly had 5 different versions of events to contend with, each one with nuggets of truth sprinkled throughout a mountain of lies and half-truths. Fortunately, however, we don't need to worry about exactly what was said by each person because in the days and weeks that followed, one definitive story supported by evidence at the crime scenes began to emerge. To start, Davidson was the mastermind of the group, and it's a bit, I don't know if I'd describe Davidson as a mastermind. And the horrific events that occurred inside his home on January 6th and 7th were largely his design. He was the person that connected all 5 of the defendants together, and the one who was constantly pushing everyone to act. This doesn't excuse anyone else's part in the crime, but it is worth noting, because without him, it's likely none of this would have transpired. In the late evening hours of January the 6th, after Davidson and Daphne had gotten into their fight and Daphne had left Davidson's home, Davidson informed his half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, that he wanted to carjack someone because he needed to secure a reliable vehicle to conduct his drug trade. Latalvis agreed, and the pair then met up with Eric Boyd and went cruising in Boyd's car. They then all traveled to the Washington Ridge apartments on the north side to collect money from someone who owed Davidson for drugs, and by happenstance spotted Chris and Channon as they were walking from Kara's apartment to Channon's Forerunner on the way to the Hall's house party. Recognizing that no one was around and believing this to be the perfect opportunity, they made their move. As Chris and Channon stood beside the Forerunner, embracing one another and apologizing for being upset, Davidson and Boyd made their move. They donned bandanas to cover their face, leapt from Boyd's car, and ambushed them from behind. One of them presented a gun to the couple, who then were ordered to keep silent and climb into the back seat of the Forerunner. Davidson and Boyd then bound the couple's hands, blindfolded them, and stuffed socks into their mouths to keep them quiet. At the same time, Cobbins slid into the driver's seat of Boyd's car and set off toward Chipman Street. Davidson followed in Channon's Forerunner. Once both cars arrived, Chris and Channon were then escorted inside, where Thomas and Coleman were waiting. Both were then tied to chairs in the living room. Nobody could explain why or how things had escalated from carjacking to kidnapping and torture, but they were all happy enough to go along with it. Jesus Christ. At first, Chris received the worst of the treatment, as he was dragged to the second bedroom and sodomized with a broken table leg. A dog collar was placed around his neck to humiliate and degrade him. Why? Why? I understand the carjacking. You need a car to, do drug dealing or whatever. But why? Why this? As this was happening, Channon was forced to call her father and report that she wouldn't be home that night. She kept her voice calm and steady, so as not to upset the men. At around 1 a.m., Chris was then escorted out of the home while blindfolded, barefoot, and still wearing the dog collar. The men walked him across the street to the railroad tracks. They then forced him to follow the tracks until they reached the area where his body would be discovered by the train conductor in a few short hours. As Chris knelt, one of the men shot him 3 times in quick succession. Which one physically pulled the trigger is still debated. Regardless, they then doused him in gasoline and set him on fire, and then returned to Davidson's home. I think in this case it doesn't matter who actually pulled the trigger, because, as I said, they're both guilty of murder under these gang laws, I think. We'll find out, I suppose. With Chris now out of the picture, the men were free to do as they pleased with Channon, and they didn't hold back. To keep details minimal, she was sexually assaulted in the most brutal ways over the course of at least a full day, while being beaten and disfigured. Disturbingly, several people stopped by Davidson's home to buy drugs while Channon was being kept tied up in the back. Channon was also still alive when Daphne came over to find out who was in Davidson's home. She was likely hogtied in the bedroom that Davidson had blocked access to. To get Daphne to leave, Davidson gave her several pieces of Channon's jewelry, along with a bag of clothing Channon had planned to donate to charity, claiming he purchased them for her. As stated earlier, Daphne Sutton is not believed to have been further involved. Cobbin's girlfriend, Vanessa Coleman, on the other hand, was. If you recall, she bragged in her diary about having one hell of an adventure in Tennessee and was also present inside the house during much of Channon's abuse. While the exact extent of her participation is in question to this day, at least one of the men stated she helped hold Channon down at one point while she was being sexually assaulted. She was also left in charge of Channon when the men left to go execute Chris. Once the men had finished with Channon, they poured bleach and drain cleaner into her open wounds, into her mouth, and onto her genitals, hoping to kill any DNA evidence present. It didn't work, and both Davidson and Cobbin's semen were later recovered. While she was still alive, they then wrapped her in trash bags and dropped her headfirst into the trash can in Davidson's kitchen. Everyone then left the home, and because Channon's hands were still bound, she was unable to free herself. She died slowly of suffocation, without knowing her friends and family were out desperately searching for her at that very moment. Meanwhile, Davidson was out robbing a Pizza Hut for some quick cash and meeting up with Daphne so they could do a drug run together. It's likely he planned to return home the following day to clean up and dispose of Channon's body, but did not expect the police to catch up with him so quickly. However, once the news broke that the bodies had been discovered inside Davidson's home, all 5 of the suspects went into hiding. Davidson and Boyd fled to the home they had recently robbed, while Cobbins, Thomas, and Coleman all hitched a ride back to Lebanon, Kentucky. Those 3 kept up with the investigation by reading articles on Cobbins' laptop until the police showed up at the front door. After piecing together this story, the 5 suspects were then charged with a variety of crimes that ranged from being an accessory to carjacking to first-degree murder. Matt mentioned at the beginning of this episode that this is why he believes in the death penalty. I'm really hoping they get the death penalty. I really am. This is crazy and just so fucking pointless. Outrage at the courthouse. Now, I teased in the intro that the KKK would come into play at some point during today's story, and that time has finally arrived. As the horrific details of what happened to Chris and Channon began to slowly leak out to the public leading up to their trials, there was tremendous pressure from many locals to have federal hate crime charges brought against the 5 suspects. This would have allowed for harsher sentences for each, regardless of how much participation could or could not be proven in state court. However, the government was hesitant to do this for one simple reason. Although the crime involved 2 white people being kidnapped, tortured, and murdered by 5 black people, it could not be established that the crime was racially motivated. I mean, Look, I don't... What has happened is horrific enough. It doesn't need to be more horrific for these people to have a needle put in their arm or be sent to prison for the rest of their lives. I don't think this is... If it's not racially motivated, it's not racially motivated. I'm not sure what indicates racial motivation here. John Gill, special counsel to Fox County District Attorney Randy Nichols, stated, "It was a terrible crime, a horrendous crime, but race was not a motive. We know from our investigation that the people charged in this case were friends with white people, socialized with white people, dated white people. So not only is there no evidence of any racial animus, there's evidence to the contrary." Now, this pissed off a lot of people who were adamant that if the races were reversed, nobody in their right minds would even be entertaining the idea that the crimes weren't racially motivated. Chris Newsom's mother Mary was very much in agreement. If this wasn't a hate crime, then I don't know how you define a hate crime. It may have started out as a carjacking, but what it developed into was blacks hating whites. To do the things they did, they would have to hate them. Look, look, what happened is terrible, but I don't... I mean, I've made enough episodes of this show to know that some people are just horrible, and I don't think that this has to be a hate crime for it to be fucking horrific. And I don't think if it was the other way around that I'd feel any different. It's very hard to say, but I don't. I don't think so. I don't feel that this discounts it or discounts the horror at all. To say that it's not, or just to say it's not a factor. I don't know. It's very hard. Soon the story gained traction on white nationalist websites like Stormfront, whose members drummed up support for both the victims and accused Knoxville's government of deliberately downplaying what had been done to Chris and Channon as a way to suppress the outrage they believed was warranted. Oh, outrage is warranted. This should not be suppressed in any way. I don't think it's being suppressed in any way. I haven't seen any evidence of that so far. They stated that because the case had not gotten much national media coverage, a cover-up was being performed that needed to be exposed. At the same time, the Ku Klux Klan then used the murders as a rallying cry to make a political stand and staged Knoxville's first Klan rally in the better part of a century. They got a permit, marched through downtown, and held signs that called for the perpetrators to be lynched. I mean, look, I'm down with these guys getting a needle in their arm. But we could go through the process and get that to happen, can't we? Tennessee's yeehaw, right? They're gonna yeehaw. They're yeehaw. They're gonna, yeah, it's happening. Please. I hope. But without a trial and stuff, that's just savagery. One of the leaders shouted out the group's frustrations. The city police and the county sheriff did their job. They got the bad guys, and when they did, that's when the iron fist of political correctness came crashing down. The political appointees that run the police department stonewalled the media and wouldn't give out the facts of these brutal murders. Is that true? I don't know if the facts weren't given out, or why not, or any of that stuff. I don't have enough information to make a call on that. Anyway, it continues. The county coroner would not release the autopsy report. The mayor and the county commissioner have done everything they could to repress public outrage. Well, we're going to blow the lid off that right now. Later, another said to the media, what else did they have to do to these people for it to be a hate crime? If whites had done this to blacks, there would have been 1,000 people out here. Well, I'll tell you the answer to that question. What else did they have to do for these people for it to be a hate crime? Well, you have to show that it was racially motivated. This is a horrific crime, but it doesn't need to be racially motivated for it to be horrific. I don't get it. While they marched, the counter-protesters gathered. Most were ordinary people, but some were part of a group calling themselves the Ku Klux Clowns. They were dressed as clowns, complete with painted faces and red noses. They rode unicycles and stood on stilts while honking horns and blowing whistles. When KKK members shouted white power, the clowns returned shouts of white powder while throwing clumps of baking flour in the air. Separating these two groups, over 300 armored KPD officers equipped with riot shields and batons stood at the ready to make sure things didn't get out of control. Alongside them, police dogs and state troopers in their signature green hats provided support. Overhead, police helicopters and a news crew circled, well aware that the situation had the potential to turn very violent at a moment's notice, but fortunately, it didn't, and both groups walked away at the end of the day completely unharmed, aside from a few people's pride, that is. Honestly, despite spending a stupid amount of time researching the minor details of this case, I'm still split on the issue. On the one hand, I agree. Other than the fact that Davidson kept referring to Chris as that white boy during his interrogation, there isn't much to suggest that the crime was racially motivated. But on the other hand, none of the defendants have ever offered an alternative explanation for how or why things escalated from a carjacking to the unrestrained sadistic cruelty Chris and Channon endured. Some people are just sick. Some people are just psychos. I've done enough episodes to know that this is the case. And you don't have to... You have to prove something, not disprove. So, I get it's complicated, but I mean... Either way, having the most notorious white supremacist group in the United States championing your cause wasn't a good look, and the public conversation about the hate crime charges was eventually overshadowed by condemnation for the Klan and their calls for extrajudicial violence. Both the Newsom and Christian families also spoke out against the Klan, accusing them of attempting to capitalize on their families' tragedies and not really caring about either Chris or Channon. Eventually, as most regular, non-Klan affiliated people shied away from the cause out of fear of being associated with racists, the possibility of hate charges were dropped altogether. The trials. The trials of Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, Coleman, and Boyd were slow, tedious, and spread across multiple years, so we won't be diving into them too deeply. I'll instead speed up and summarize. In terms of specific charges against each, Davidson, Cobbins, and Thomas were all hit with a total of 46 counts, 16 for felony murder related to the rape, robbery, and kidnapping of Chris and Channon, 2 for premeditated murder, 2 for especially aggravated robbery, 4 for especially aggravated kidnapping, 20 for aggravated rape, and 2 for theft. They, as well as Vanessa Coleman, were to be tried at Knox County Criminal Court. Half of Vanessa's charges would be slightly lesser because she agreed to testify on behalf of the prosecution against the other men. As such, she was granted immunity for the carjacking charges, but the more severe charges of murder and sexual assault were left open. The final defendant, Boyd, was the only one charged in federal court, but because physical evidence against him was lacking, they could not charge him with murder, at least not yet. Instead, he was accused of being an accessory to a fatal carjacking and failing to report the location of a known fugitive. Yeah, Boyd came along later, right? He was the guy that I was like, he's the guy from prison who'll help you clean up a crime or some such. Latavius Cobbins was the first to go to state trial in 2009, and the evidence tying him to the crime was plentiful. His fingerprints were found inside the Forerunner and inside Davidson's home. His sperm was found in Shannon's mouth and on her camisole, her sweater, and her jeans. Vanessa Coleman placed him within Davidson's home at the time of the murder and testified that he participated in the whole ordeal. In the end, there was no room for debate. He was found guilty of first-degree felony murder for Channon and facilitating the death of Chris. On August the 26th, 2009, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. No consideration of the death penalty? Tennessee, yeehaw, come on. This feels like a death penalty crime. Likewise, the case against Davidson was exceptionally easy to prove. There's no way Davidson's not getting the death penalty. He was the ringleader. Latavius Cobbins deserves it. Davidson deserves it thoroughly. Maybe Tennessee just doesn't have the death penalty. Not only was he arrested while wearing Chris's shoes, and all the other defendants had pointed to him as the ringleader, but his fingerprints had also been collected from countless items that belonged to both Chris and Channon, as well as, most damningly, the trash bags that held the body. These prints were pressed and stretched deeply onto the bags, indicating that they'd been loaded when he touched them. Additionally, Davidson's sperm was found inside Shannon's vagina, anus, and inside of her jeans, making it very clear that he had participated in the sexual assault. Davidson's pitiful defense, if you can even call it that, was that he had not carjacked Chris and Channon, and the reason they were inside his home in the first place was because they'd stopped by to purchase drugs from him. Cobbins and Thomas had been responsible for escalating the situation. They'd done all the kidnapping, torturing, and killing after he had left the home later in the night. His defense against the DNA evidence was that Channon had consented to sex with him before the other men assaulted and killed her. As proof, his defense team pointed to the fact that Davidson's sperm was found on the inner thigh of Shannon's jeans, which would have only been possible if she'd put her jeans back on after having sex with him. Thankfully, the jury didn't buy any of that shit, and Lamarcus Davidson was unanimously found guilty on all counts. His sentence was death! Yes! Oh my god, well deserved. When was this? 2009. He could still be alive, couldn't he? God, I hope they've killed him by now. God, for my lust for blood. Let's get him dead. Unfortunately, without the hate crime charges, The death penalty was not on the table for George Thomas, who argued that none of the forensic evidence at the crime scenes linked him to the murders. Why is death penalty not? Why does it have to be a hate crime to have the death penalty? Earlier on, I was saying it shouldn't be a hate crime, but now maybe I'm changing my mind. Who argued that none of the forensic evidence at the crime scene linked him to the murders. This was true, but combining all the circumstantial evidence, the testimony from Coleman, and the transcripts from 12 incriminating phone conversations Thomas had while incarcerated. Bro, you have incriminating phone calls while you're in jail? Of course they're recording that, dude. What are you doing? He was found guilty and sentenced to multiple counts of life in prison without the possibility of parole. I feel, that's right. I don't necessarily know if he needs the death penalty, because he seems to be obviously involved, and I'd say life without parole is serious as it gets without death. I probably think that's what that guy deserves. When it came time for Vanessa Coleman to face the music at her own trial, she fared much better than the rest. Her defense was that she was as much a victim as Channon because Davidson had held her hostage as well during the murders. Because of the lack of certainty of her involvement, the prosecutors were not able to prove the first-degree murder charges. After a day and a half of deliberation, the jury found her innocent of first-degree murder, but guilty of the lesser charge of facilitating the murder of both Chris and Channon. That's still a very major crime. As such, she was not eligible for the death penalty. I don't think she would... I don't necessarily think she deserves the death penalty. She was sentenced to 53 years in prison. Yep. Say that feels pretty fair, to be honest. And finally, though his trial chronologically took place before the other 4 defendants, I saved Eric Boyd for last because his trial was most unique. Not only was he the only defendant to be tried in federal court, but he was also the only one not charged with murder, at least for now. On April the 16th, 2008, he was found guilty of being an accessory to a fatal carjacking and failing to report the location of a known fugitive. For this, he was given 18 years in federal prison, meaning he'd be eligible for release no later than 2025, although that would eventually change. That's this year. The scandal. Another thing that I teased in the intro was that there would be several retrials because the judge who oversaw the trials of all 4 state defendants, Judge Richard Baumgartner, would soon find himself embroiled in a scandal that would throw every case he presided over for the past several years into question. Yes, I forgot about that. You see, while Judge Baumgartner had served as Knox County's criminal court judge since 1992, a 2011 investigation by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation... I didn't know that states had their own little FBIs. The TBI revealed, I guess they're not FBI because that's, in the name federal, but I see, revealed that he had been, among other things, coming to court severely intoxicated. Specifically, his administrative assistant, Jennifer Judy, explains how he would often come to work so impaired that his clerks would have to push his hearings until the following day. If he allowed it, that is. Some days he'd simply buck up and sit on the bench while reeking of booze from the night before. Even worse, she also claimed that district attorneys, defense attorneys, and even other judges all knew of Baumgartner's addiction and did not step in. Things became so, because if you do, and then they're like, no, there's nothing to it, then that judge is going to be biased against you. I mean, I know they're not supposed to be and all of that, but that's risky career-wise. Things became so bad that he went to rehab in 2008, but he was still not able to get his drinking under control. Yet this was only the beginning of the issues with Baumgartner. He was also addicted to pain pills and had been having an extramarital sexual relationship with a woman named Dina Castleman. Castleman was a participant in a drug court program over which Baumgartner once presided. She would eventually become his mistress and pain pill supplier, and they would meet up to take pills and have sex while court was in recess. Your life is crazy, Baumgartner. She would later cooperate with the TBI, who would summarize her statements in the following way, quote, "She said Baumgartner was constantly telling her she was attractive and making verbal advances. This made her very uncomfortable because she'd always looked up to him as a father figure, and he was a judge. However, Castleman said that she did not have any family in the area. Her mother had died, she was behind on bills and had no money, and to have a judge paying any attention and showing interest in you made her feel good." End quote. Honestly, paying attention doesn't explain the lengths that Baumgartner went to help her. On several occasions, he contacted other judges in attempts to have various charges against her dropped. He also bought a cell phone for her to contact him when buying drugs for him, helped her arrange housing at the YMCA's Transitional Housing Unit, and helped her procure what he believed was clean urine to pass a drug test. Then, when that urine still failed the drug test, he attempted to keep her out of jail while intervening on her behalf in court. This is all very, very dodgy. Very, very dodgy. Honestly, if your jaw is not on the floor by now, I don't know what else to tell you. But this is still not the end of the story. Dude, this guy's life's crazy. The TBI's 1,200-page report on Baumgartner has never been made public, and all the information we have about his crimes comes from summary reports. We'll likely never know the full truth for a long time, because that file has been marked exempt from Tennessee's Open Records Act for unknown reasons. He's reached out to someone, hasn't he? To this day, it is housed at TBI's headquarters and is only allowed to be viewed under very, very special circumstances and with the approval of the TBI. Regardless, after being questioned by the TBI, Baumgartner stepped down, citing medical reasons, but criminal charges would eventually be brought against him and he would be disbarred after it was later confirmed he'd spent at least 2 years sitting on the bench while impaired. Here is a picture of Baumgartner. He looks like a judge. He doesn't look particularly alcoholic, he just looks old. Later, he would also be charged and found guilty in federal court of 5 counts of misprision of a felony? I don't know what that is. Of these charges, the U.S. Attorney Office stated, the evidence presented at trial demonstrated that the defendant made material misrepresentations to various officials concerning Dina Castleman in efforts to conceal her participation in a federal prescription drug trafficking conspiracy. The evidence showed that his motive involved her continued participation in the conspiracy so she could provide drugs and sexual favors to him. No shit. On April 10th, 2013, Baumgartner was sentenced to 6 months in prison plus 1 year of supervised release. Dude, I don't imagine a judge has a good-ass time in prison. They'll be like, you're the judge, you set me down. It's hard to overstate how big of a scandal this was for Knox County, because every single case it presided over was suddenly cast into extreme doubt. His conviction opened the door to thousands of Knox County cases being re-examined and possibly retried over the coming years, thus overwhelming the court system as appeal after appeal flooded in. And this is unfortunately where the 4 state defendants come back into play. One of the people who was allowed to view the 1,200-page report on Baumgartner was Special Judge John Kerry Blackwood, who was tasked with deciding if Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, and Coleman could receive new trials in light of the misconduct. I don't think so. The jury sent them down, right? He reportedly read the entire summary from start to finish and determined that 155 pages of the 1,200 were relevant to the Newsom Christian cases and that all 4 should be retried. Once again, we're not exactly sure what these pages contain because the file is sealed, which caused a lot of fuss about whether or not he was making the right decision. I mean, you got to trust that he's seen the documents. We haven't. We can't judge his decision because we don't know. Further doubt was then thrown into the mix when the Tennessee Supreme Court vacated Blackwood's ruling and ordered that he reconsider. Blackwood then did reconsider briefly before reaffirming his original ruling. All 4 should be given new trials. At this point, both the Newsom and Christian families were getting whiplash, as was the prosecutor's office. They requested that Blackwood recuse himself from the case because they believed he'd become too emotionally invested. In what? The murderers? What the f***? This did not go over well, and the district attorney got into a verbal argument with Blackwood in court, which resulted in Blackwood threatening to hold him in contempt. However, that didn't happen. Blackwood did eventually step down from the case when it became clear he was emotionally invested. At this point, the whole appeals process was so messy that it was unclear what would happen, so another judge, Senior Judge Walter Kurz, was appointed to sort the mess out. After reviewing the evidence, he made his final decision. Cobbins and Davidson would not be retried because their participation was certainly proven beyond a reasonable doubt. However, Thomas and Coleman would. This was comparatively a win for the families, as Davidson would remain on death row. But now, the second retrials for the 2 shakiest convictions would start. At a new trial, the jury for Vanessa Coleman was selected from Jackson, Tennessee, an area 300 miles west of Knoxville, to reduce the chance of bias. This time, she was found guilty of facilitation of aggravated kidnapping, facilitation of rape, and the facilitation of the murder of Channon Christian, but not of Christopher Newsom. There was simply not enough evidence. This meant her charges would be significantly reduced. Instead of the original 53 years, her lawyers asked for 20 years, while prosecutors asked for 50. Blackwood landed in the middle, sentencing her to 35 years minus time served. While giving his sentence, the senior judge once again echoed what we already know. He called the crime the most horrible murder he had ever seen. As for George Thomas, his fate was redecided on May the 17th, 2013, when the new jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 38 counts. This was the same verdict as before, so he was then resentenced to double life plus 25 years. He then appealed his conviction as high as the Supreme Court of the United States, who ultimately refused to review the case. However, an opportunity did eventually arise for him to reduce his sentence when it became clear state prosecutors were about to go after Boyd with more charges. How are you going to get them reduced to anything that isn't seeing you die in prison? You're double lifing it plus 25, dude. You're not getting out. In 2018, 11 years after his conviction in federal court, 36 charges were brought against Eric Boyd after new forensic techniques revealed his fingerprints on the holster of the gun used to execute Chris Newsom. This, combined with George Thomas promising to testify that he participated in the killing, allowed the Knox County DA's office to prosecute for first-degree felony murder, first-degree premeditated murder, especially aggravated robbery, especially aggravated kidnapping, and aggravated rape. This feels like we could go death penalty now. Now he's found guilty of all charges, sentenced to life, plus 90 extra years for good measure. In exchange for his testimony against Boyd, George Thomas's sentence was reduced to a flat 50 years, 25 for each murder, thus ending the long, complicated trial saga. It's disappointing. 50 years means he could potentially get out someday. Maybe an old-ass man, but I don't like that idea. Today, Cobbins and Thomas are housed at the Northeast Correctional Complex. Cobbins will never be released, while Thomas is scheduled to be released as early as May of 2053. He will then be 70 years old. I don't like that. Keep him in prison forever. Eric Boyd is incarcerated at the Turney Center Industrial Complex, where he is to remain until at least 2167, ensuring he'll never again walk the streets as a free man. Lamarcus Davidson is at the Riverbend... Oh no, so he's still alive? Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, where he awaits his death sentence. He's one of 44 listed names on Tennessee's death row offenders waitlist, although the exact date of his execution has not been decided yet. Vanessa Coleman, the only person in the group who's currently eligible for parole, is housed at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. In 2020, she went before a 7-person parole board who unanimously refused to release her. Her next opportunity for parole will be in 2030. Unconfirmed reports from fellow inmates inside the prison claim she is wholly unrepentant for her part in the crimes. Well, you. As for Davidson's home, it was demolished in 2008 after Waste Connections purchased the property to turn it into a memorial. Good for you, Waste Connections. That's a nice thing to do. Shannon's mother has told the media that she makes sure to visit at least once a year, despite the pain it causes her. The section of Chipman Street where this memorial is located is blocked from Google Street View. And finally, to further memorialize the victims, separate local scholarships and sports tournaments have been created in both Channon and Chris's names. Channon has the Shannongale Christian Memorial Golf Tournament, while Chris has an annual baseball tournament at Halls Community Park. It just celebrated its 17th year. I don't have anything to add at the end of this episode. Thanks for being here.